What do women really want? Do women truly desire a 12-inch penis? It's fascinating how something so personal, so intimate, becomes a public obsession. We talk about it as if size alone could define pleasure, confidence, or connection. But when we strip away the noise, the comparisons, the ego, what remains is a much more human story. A story about what actually feels good, what creates closeness, and what women really choose when no one is watching. Several studies have tried to answer this question not by asking women what they say they want, but by observing what they actually do. Because what we say and what we choose are not always the same. Researchers examined best-selling sex toys, focusing on those made for vaginal pleasure. The idea was simple. What women buy and use privately might tell us something far more truthful than what they say publicly, because in privacy there is honesty. Across major adult retailers, the most commonly purchased insertable lengths range between 4 and 6 in. Yes, 4 to 6 in. Even more interesting, on most of those platforms the average was under 6 in, and the average girth less than 4.5 inches. That's almost identical to the natural average size of an erect penis. Most men fall between 5 and 6 in length with a circumference of around 4.5 to 5. In other words, the so-called average is already what most women choose when they have complete freedom. That's not coincidence. That's clarity. Another study looked specifically at realistic dildos, the ones labeled as best sellers from largest retailers and Amazon. Here, the average insertable length was around 6.5 in, just slightly above average. Perhaps that small difference reflects curiosity, a desire for variety, a little experimentation. But still, it's nowhere near. These findings tell a quiet truth. When given the choice, women don't reach for the biggest. They reach for what feels right, what feels real, what feels like their body's natural rhythm. And that in itself is deeply revealing. Another interesting layer of research looked at what actually drives the popularity of certain toys. The results were almost poetic. Price and comfort mattered far more than length. Women cared more about fit than fantasy, more about how it feels inside their body than about how it looks in the abstract. In fact, thicker or oversized options often sold less than average ones. So, what does that tell us? That even when women have full control, when they choose for themselves without judgment, without performance, they still choose average. Maybe a touch longer, maybe a little variation, but never the extremes. Because pleasure is not about quantity. It's about connection, between body and sensation, between self and desire. And that changes everything. We have been fed a story that bigger is better, that masculinity is measured in inches, that a man's worth is tied to what he can show, not what he can feel. But when women decide privately, the fantasy fades and the truth emerges. They choose what feels safe, what feels natural, what allows them to open and surrender rather than endure or perform. This is the part we so rarely speak about. Pleasure is not about domination. It's about presence. It's about being attuned. It's about rhythm, breathing, emotional attunement, and trust. And that's something no measurement can define. The data, the patterns, the choices, they all point in the same direction. If you are within the average range, you are enough. You are more than enough. There is no deficiency to fix, no fantasy to chase, no comparison to survive. Yes, there will always be exceptions. There will always be jokes, exaggerations, loud opinions. But in truth, when women are free to choose privately, they choose comfort, connection, and authenticity. That is what real desire looks like. There's also a smaller piece of research that adds a gentle nuance. Some women who reach orgasm mainly through vaginal stimulation show a mild preference for slightly longer sizes. But the difference is small, an inch at most. And even then, their satisfaction depends far more on emotional and psychological connection than on size. Because the body is not separate from the mind. The mind is the largest erogenous zone of all. Pleasure grows in safety. It deepens in trust. It expands through communication and emotional understanding. Size alone does not create desire. Desire is born from curiosity, confidence, and connection. When you feel comfortable in your body, when you stop comparing, when you become present to the moment, that's when intimacy truly happens. So perhaps the real question was never about size. Perhaps it's about how we touch, how we listen, how we see each other without fear or performance. Because that's what makes people feel alive in bed. Not inches, not numbers, but the feeling of being chosen, being safe, being desired as you are. That's what women remember. That's what keeps desire alive. So, let's release the myths. Let's quiet the comparisons. Let's remember that what makes you attractive, what makes you a good lover has nothing to do with size. It has everything to do with presence. Be present. Be curious. Be confident. Because when you bring those qualities into intimacy, you stop performing and start connecting. And that, more than anything else, is what creates pleasure that lasts. So if you've ever doubted yourself, let this truth settle in your body. You're already enough. You don't need to be more. You simply need to be here fully, honestly, and without shame, because that's where real connection begins, and that's where real desire never ends.